A camel protects a baby from a sandstorm. What happened next is unforgettable. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting an orange-red hue across the endless stretch of desert. The air shimmered with heat, the vast emptiness pressing against the senses as far as the eye could see. The ground was a dry, cracked mosaic of sand and stone, and the wind, carrying the scent of earth and dust, whispered in the distance. It was a place where time seemed to stand still, where the relentless sun and unyielding sand shaped everything that survived. But today something different was stirring in the winds of the desert. A strange unease, an unspoken forewarning hung in the air. The wind was no longer the gentle, warm caress that it always was. It had become sharp, biting, and ferocious, like an angry animal roused from its slumber. The sands seemed to dance in erratic spirals, and the sky, once clear and tranquil, began to darken with the swirling threat of an approaching storm. In the midst of this desolate landscape, a lone figure moved steadily across the sand. His name was Arif, a young man of about 25 with dark, weather-beaten skin and a gaze that spoke of years spent in the unforgiving embrace of the desert. His clothes were simple, a faded tunic and loose trousers, worn from use but perfectly suited for the desert's harsh environment. He was a herder, a man who had learned the desert's rhythms since childhood, navigating its dangers with a calm and collected demeanor. But today something felt wrong. Arif had been walking for hours, guiding his small flock of goats across the barren expanse, when the winds began to pick up. His heart raced as he looked up to the sky, now shifting in color from deep blue to an ominous gray. A storm was coming, and it was not one of the usual sandstorms that passed by like a fleeting nuisance. No, this was different. The storm, with its roar and ferocity, was not something he could outrun, not in this desolate place, with no shelter or escape in sight. The winds howled louder now, twisting the sand into sharp-edged blades that cut through, the air stinging Arif's skin. He shielded his face with his hand and scanned the horizon desperately. There in the distance, he saw the shape of a camel. The majestic animal, one that Arif had known since childhood, was moving toward him, its gait steady and purposeful, despite the growing tempest. The camel's name was Raja. To most people, Raja was just another beast of burden, a faithful companion to Arif's family for many years. But to Arif, Raja was more than that. He was a protector, a creature of great strength and even greater loyalty. For Arif, Raja had always been the anchor in the chaos of the desert, a presence of calm in a world of unpredictability. As the wind began to howl even louder, Arif felt a sudden surge of fear. He knew the storm would be dangerous, perhaps even deadly, but his first concern was not for himself. It was for the tiny bundle nestled tightly in his arms. His baby sister, Meher, barely a year old, had been asleep in the small cloth wrap across his chest. Her fragile form, so helpless and vulnerable, felt like a weight far heavier than any burden he had ever carried. The thought of the storm was terrifying enough, but the thought of her being caught in it was unbearable. He gritted his teeth, trying to ignore the sharp stabs of fear that were growing inside him like a gnawing hunger. He had to protect her. He couldn't let her be swept away into the chaos. As he looked at Raja, something within him clicked. Without thinking, he called out to the camel, his voice barely rising above the deafening roar of the wind. "Raja," he shouted, his tone urgent. "We need to move. Get Meher to safety." The camel, seemingly hearing the fear in his voice, quickened its pace, its strong legs carrying it over the sand with ease. Raja had always been an intelligent animal, quick to sense the mood of its rider. But today it wasn't just Arif's fear that Raja sensed. The camel, too, felt the storm approaching, felt the danger that lurked in its swirling, sand-filled maw. The storm hit with the force of a crashing wave. The air turned thick with dust, and the winds howled in a deafening symphony of chaos. Arif's heart pounded in his chest as he clung to Meher, his arms wrapped tightly around her, his gaze fixed on the camel ahead. The sand stung his face, blinding him for moments at a time. The world around him seemed to disintegrate into a blur of brown and grey, the air thick with the promise of something far worse than just a passing gust. It was at that moment, in the heart of the storm, that Arif realized something. The bond between him and Raja, the bond between man and animal, was the only thing that could protect them from this storm. There would be no escape. The world had become a furnace of sand and wind, and they were trapped in the center of it. But there was hope too. The hope that if they stayed together, if they trusted each other, they might survive. Arif's eyes met Raja's, and for a split second, in the midst of the swirling chaos, the camel seemed to understand. Its eyes were steady, calm. Everything. The storm was not. It was a silent vow, a promise of protection, a declaration of loyalty. In that brief moment, the two of them, man and animal, shared something deeper than words. They shared survival. And then, as the storm raged around them, a small, trembling cry broke through the tumult. Meher Arif's heart skipped a beat. Her tiny voice, lost in the storm's fury, called out to him, fragile and frightened. He tightened his grip around her and pressed her closer to his chest. Her little hands gripped the fabric of his tunic, her face buried in his warmth, but he could feel her fear, feel the shiver of terror that ran through her tiny body. It was then that the full weight of their situation crashed down on him. The storm was not just a force of nature, it was a test of everything they had known, everything they had believed. The desert had never been kind, but today it was more dangerous than ever. But Arif wasn't alone. Not anymore. He looked up at Raja, whose enormous frame loomed above him. There was no doubt in his mind now. The camel would do everything it could to protect him and his sister. The storm, fierce as it was, would not break their bond. As the wind tore at their bodies, whipping sand into their eyes and skin, the unlikely trio, man, camel, and child, continued their march through the storm, each step more treacherous than the last. What would happen next was unimaginable. But one thing was certain: they would face it together. The storm would reveal more than just the fury of nature. It would test the limits of survival, the power of loyalty, and the resilience of the spirit. And in its aftermath, the memory of this day would be etched into the fabric of Arif's soul forever. For in the heart of the storm, something truly unforgettable was about to unfold. The desert was not just a place, it was a life. A harsh, unforgiving life, but a life that Arif knew better than anything else. From the moment he had been old enough to walk, he had been taught the rhythms of the desert, the language of the wind, and the ways of survival. His home was a small village, nestled on the edge of a vast desert expanse. The village itself was no more than a handful of homes, modest, humble dwellings made from sun-dried mud bricks, their flat roofs providing a place to sleep under the starry sky when the nights weren't too cold. Arif had grown up here in the shadow of the great dunes, with the desert always in his blood. His father had been a herder, as had his father before him. And now Arif had taken on the mantle of responsibility for his family's herd, leading the goats and camels through the wilderness, watching over them like the protector he had always known he was meant to be. Life in the desert was not easy, but it was steady. There was an order to things, a time for work, a time for rest, a time for celebration, and a time for mourning. Every man and woman in the village knew their place in this delicate ecosystem of survival. Most days, Arif's life was simple. He would rise early, just before the sun, when the air was still cool and the world was quiet. He would take the herd out, walking alongside the goats, leading the camels, sometimes talking softly to the animals as they moved through the dry brush, seeking out whatever sparse vegetation could be found in the desolate land. The sound of hooves and footsteps was the only music he knew. In the evenings, after the sun had set and the sky turned a deep fading purple, he would return home, the herd safely behind him. His mother would greet him with a warm smile, a bowl of simple food waiting for him. But there was always something more to his world than just the routine of daily life. He had a family, a younger sister, Meher, who was the joy of his life. Her wide, curious eyes and her infectious laugh were a constant reminder of what was worth protecting in this harsh, unforgiving world. Meher, still a child, had not yet known the desert's true cruelty. She hadn't yet felt the isolation that came with living in such a remote place, nor had she experienced the full weight of the storms that could sweep through the region, threatening everything in their path. Arif kept her close, wrapped safely in his arms as much as he could, sheltering her from the dangers that lurked in the sands. Arif's father, an old man now, had long since retired from the arduous work of herding. He spent his days in their home, resting in the shade of the small courtyard, telling stories from the past. Arif had grown up listening to those stories, tales of battles fought against nature's fury, of animals that were both allies and adversaries, and of ancestors who had thrived in the desert's harshest conditions. His father's words were always filled with a sense of respect for the land and its power. "The desert is not just a place, son," he would say. "It's a teacher, and a hard one at that. But if you listen to it, if you pay attention, it will give you everything you need to survive." Arif respected his father's wisdom, but there were days when he couldn't shake the feeling that the desert was shifting, that the balance between man and nature was beginning to crack. Perhaps it was the endless cycles of storms, or the strange absence of animals in certain areas where they had once roamed in abundance. Whatever the reason, Arif had felt an unease in his heart lately, a feeling that the stability of his world was about to be tested. His bond with Raja, the camel, was something that only someone who had lived with the desert's rhythms could understand. The camel was not just an animal to him, it was a part of his family. Raja had been with them for years, a towering figure in Arif's life, with deep brown eyes that seemed to understand the weight of every word spoken. To it, Raja was strong, reliable, and had a calm demeanor that matched Arif's own. Together they made an unstoppable pair. The camel carried not only the physical load of the herd, but also the emotional load of the family's legacy. Arif often found himself talking to Raja, not just to give commands, but to share his thoughts. He would speak to the animal about his concerns for Meher's future, about his hopes for the land, and even about his own desires to see something beyond the endless sand dunes that stretched before him. "Do you ever wonder, Raja," he once said, "what it would be like to see something different, to see the green of the fields or the glistening water of a river?" The camel, in its silent wisdom, would simply blink slowly, its massive eyelids shutting, before opening again as though pondering the question. And then, as if to reassure Arif, Raja would nudge him with its long nose, a comforting gesture that made him smile despite the uncertainty that plagued him. But these thoughts, these moments of reflection, were fleeting. Arif knew better than to dwell on them for too long. The desert demanded action, not contemplation. It was unforgiving, and the only way to survive was to keep moving forward, one step at a time. On one particular morning, after a long night of hearing the winds pick up and the temperature dip to near freezing, Arif stood at the edge of the village, looking out at the vast emptiness of the desert. His hand rested on Raja's back, feeling the familiar warmth of the animal's thick fur beneath his fingers. The air was still, but there was an energy in it. Something was stirring. Meher, still a baby, was nestled in the shawl that Arif always wore, a small bundle of warmth against his chest. She was sleeping soundly, unaware of the world beyond her. Small protective cocoon, Arif felt the weight of responsibility press down on him, the weight of his family, of the land, and of the future. There was no going back from the life he had chosen. It was a life of quiet endurance, of survival against the odds. But as the wind began to pick up again, carrying with it the familiar scent of the desert, Arif couldn't help but feel a shift. In the air, something was coming, something that would change everything. It wasn't just the storm. It was the feeling that the balance he had always known was about to be broken. And as he stood there, with Raja by his side and Meher safely tucked in his arms, he couldn't help but wonder if he was ready for whatever was coming. The day had begun like any other. The sun rose, casting its golden light over the desert, and Arif began his routine, leading the herd across the vast sun-baked earth. The goats bleated softly, and Raja, his faithful camel, moved with the familiar, steady rhythm that Arif had grown accustomed to. Meher slept in her sling, her tiny form nestled securely against his chest as he walked through the sand. The world seemed at peace, though there was an edge to the air that Arif could not shake. As he walked, his thoughts turned again to the desert's recent changes. The wind had been erratic lately, picking up unexpectedly, and the animals seemed more restless than usual. Birds flew high in the sky, but even they seemed agitated, circling, above with no clear purpose. It was as if the land itself was preparing for something that Arif couldn't yet understand. The storm raged for what felt like hours, each minute a battle against the desert's fury. Arif clung to Raja, the camel's broad body offering some shelter from the worst of the wind, though it couldn't shield them entirely from the relentless battering of the sand. Meher's fragile form, tucked tightly against his chest, quivered, with fear as the storm howled around them, her small hands clutching his tunic with desperate strength. The world beyond them had become a whirlwind of dust and chaos, the once familiar landscape swallowed by an impenetrable veil of brown. The car. Roar of the storm was deafening, the winds howling like a beast that could not be tamed. Arif's thoughts were frantic. His focus was split between keeping his feet steady in the shifting sand and ensuring Meher remained safe in his arms. Each step forward was a struggle, the terrain unstable and treacherous, and yet there was no time to hesitate. There was no time to wonder what might be waiting for them beyond the storm. He could only move step by agonizing step, trusting that he would find something, anything to hold on to. The storm seemed endless. It pressed in from all sides, its grip tightening around them. The sun was lost to the sky, hidden beneath layers of swirling dust. He could barely see a few feet ahead of him, and yet the ground beneath his feet seemed to shift beneath him like a living thing pulling at his legs, dragging him down. Arif's chest tightened with fear. How long would it be before they succumbed to the desert's wrath? Just as the weight of despair began to settle in, Arif felt something, a movement, in the distance. His heart skipped a beat, his senses straining to pick out any sign of hope amid the storm's madness. At first it was just a shadow, a shape that seemed to materialize out of the dust. The wind howled louder, drowning out all other sounds. But this shape grew clearer, moving steadily toward them through the swirling sand. Arif's pulse quickened. Was it a mirage? No. It was too solid, too real. As the figure drew closer, the outline of a camel emerged, its massive form cutting through the storm with an ease that seemed impossible. The animal moved with purpose, its hooves steady on the shifting ground, its head held high, eyes locked onto Arif as if it had known exactly where to find him. A wave of disbelief washed over Arif. Was this some kind of divine intervention? Had the desert sent this creature to guide them through the storm? For a moment he simply stared, unable to process what he was seeing. The camel's rider, a figure cloaked in desert garb, sat firmly in the saddle, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. The man's eyes, though obscured by the shade, burned, with an intensity that sent a jolt of recognition through Arif. There was something ancient and knowing about him, a wisdom that resonated with Arif on a deep, primal level. This was no ordinary traveler. This was someone who understood the desert, someone who had lived with it, and perhaps more importantly, someone who had learned to navigate its dangers with an almost unnatural sense of direction. The figure moved closer, the camel's pace unhurried despite the storm's fury. With each step, the distance between them shrank, and Arif could make out more details. The rider's clothes were worn but well-maintained, made from a mixture of leather and thick, weathered fabric. His boots were dusted with sand, and the camel beneath him was strong and steady, its large, intelligent eyes scanning the surroundings with practiced vigilance. As the rider neared, he spoke. His voice, deep and calm, seemed to cut through the storm's roar with ease. "You won't make it on your own," he said, his words carrying an eerie confidence. "The storm is not just a test of strength, it's a test of understanding." Arif, still struggling to comprehend the appearance of this mysterious figure, barely managed to respond. His throat was dry from the dust, and his voice barely rose. Above a whisper, "Who are you?" The man's lips curled into a faint smile beneath his veil. "I am someone who has survived the desert's wrath, and I can show you how to survive it too." The rider reached down and, without a moment's hesitation, took Meher from Arif's arms, cradling her gently but firmly against his chest. Arif's heart pounded in his chest as he watched, a mix of fear and gratitude rushing through him. Who was this man to take his sister, to trust him so implicitly with her life? But before he could protest, the rider gave him a reassuring look. "She will be safe," the man said, his voice soft but resolute. "I know what the desert demands, and I know what it will give." Arif, still in shock, looked at Raja, who had paused in its tracks, eyes wide and alert. The camel seemed to trust this stranger, its large, leathery ears flicking with curiosity. Arif hesitated for a moment longer, still unsure, but then a flicker of instinct, of trust in the bond that the desert had forged between them, pushed him to make a decision. "Take us out of here," Arif said, his voice raw but determined. The rider nodded, a simple, almost imperceptible movement, and with a practiced motion he nudged his camel into motion, leading Arif and Raja through the storm's chaotic path. Arif followed, trusting in the figure's lead, his eyes fixed on the back of the rider's cloak as they moved steadily through the sands. The storm, which had seemed to close in on them from all sides, suddenly felt less oppressive. The rider's camel moved with an otherworldly grace, the camel's hooves leaving clear, stable marks in the shifting sand, guiding the way like a living compass. Arif couldn't explain it, but there was a sense of calm in the rider's presence, as though he had been in this exact situation 1,000 times before. He moved with such certainty, his every step in tune with the desert's rhythm, and despite the ferocity of the storm, the path before them began to open, the sand parting like the tide. As they moved deeper into the storm, the rider glanced back, his eyes meeting Arif's for the briefest of moments. There was no fear in the man's gaze, only an ancient understanding, as though he had faced storms like this and far worse before. "The desert," he said softly, his voice carrying over the howl of the wind, "is not a place to conquer. It is a place to respect." Arif nodded, the words sinking in as they continued their journey. The storm raged on, but with this stranger's guidance, the world around them no longer felt quite so hostile. It was as though the very sands themselves had begun to bend to his will, opening paths that seemed impossible moments before. There was hope now, a flicker of light amidst the storm's relentless fury. For the first time since the storm had struck, Arif allowed himself to believe that they might just make it through. By midday, the temperature had risen to its usual oppressive heat, but the winds had started to pick up again. A subtle shift in the air alerted Arif to the fact that something was coming, something big. He looked at Raja, who was walking slightly ahead of him, its long legs moving gracefully through the sand. The camel's ears were back, its movements more cautious, as if it too could feel the change in the wind. Arif paused, wiping the sweat from his brow, and glanced at the horizon. It was clear at first, but as he watched, the sky began to darken at the edges. The clouds gathered in the distance, thickening into something ominous. A storm was coming. His heart began to race. He had seen sandstorms before, fierce, unrelenting, storms that could appear out of nowhere and change the landscape in a matter of minutes. But there was something about this one that felt different. The air felt thick and heavy, like the desert was holding its breath, waiting. Arif turned to the herd, his voice calm but urgent. "Move," he called out. "We need to find shelter before it hits." Raja, sensing the urgency in his voice, picked up its pace, moving faster through the sand. Arif quickened his steps, his gaze scanning the horizon, looking for any sign of shelter. But there was nothing. The endless desert stretched out before him, barren and unforgiving. There was no tree, no cave, no rocky outcrop to provide refuge. The storm was coming, and it was coming fast. In that moment, the wind shifted, a sharp gust biting at Arif's skin, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of dust and earth. He could hear the storm before he could see it, the low rumbling growl of the wind rising in intensity, as if the desert itself were preparing to roar. He turned to look at Meher, who was still sleeping soundly against his chest, unaware of the danger approaching. His protective instincts surged within him. He could not let this storm catch them unprepared. Not her, not now. With urgency in his movements, Arif called out to the herd, urging them to move faster. The goats bleated nervously, and Raja, ever steady, pushed forward with its long strides, its feet kicking up the sand as it trotted ahead. Arif glanced over his shoulder, the storm now looming behind him like a dark wall, swallowing up the blue sky and the sunlight. The temperature had dropped and the wind had begun to howl, whipping at his face, and then, Just as he thought they might be able to outrun it, the storm descended with terrifying force. It wasn't just the wind that struck, it was the sand, thick and blinding, lashing out in all directions. The storm arrived in full force, a whirling, chaotic mass of dust and debris. Arif's breath caught in his throat as the world around him turned into a blur of brown and grey. He struggled to see through the thick veil of dust, the sting of sand piercing his skin. He felt Meher stir against him, her small hands tightening on the fabric of his tunic. His heart raced. He had to protect her. The storm would tear them apart if he wasn't careful. "Raja!" Arif shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the winds. "We have to keep moving," the camel responded, its hooves pounding against the ground as it pushed forward, Arif clinging to its side for guidance. The winds howled, and the sand stung his eyes, but Raja remained steady. The camel's large form loomed in the mist of dust, an unshakable presence in the chaos of the storm. But even Raja could not guarantee safety in a storm this fierce. Arif could feel the sand shifting beneath his feet, the ground unstable and treacherous. He felt the familiar weight of Meher's tiny body in his arms, but the force of the storm made it difficult to move, to think clearly. He couldn't see where he was going, couldn't tell where the herd had gone. The world was a blur of sand and wind, and his only focus was to stay on his feet, to keep moving forward. And then, as if out of nowhere, a sudden gust of wind knocked him off balance. He staggered, his feet slipping in the sand, and for a terrifying moment he thought he might fall. His arms instinctively wrapped tighter around Meher, his body falling forward, but at the last moment Raja was there, steady and strong. The camel's long neck turned toward him, and with surprising gentleness Raja nudged him back to his feet, offering its sturdy body as a support. "Thank you, Raja," Arif muttered, his voice filled with a mixture of fear and gratitude. Without the camel's steady presence, he knew they wouldn't stand a chance. But as the storm continued to rage, Arif realized something else, something even more terrifying. The storm wasn't just a sudden burst of nature's fury. It was alive, moving, shifting, and seemingly closing in on them with a calculated purpose. The swirling winds, the unrelenting sand, the feeling of being trapped, they all signaled that this was no ordinary storm. Something had changed in the desert, something that was far more dangerous than Arif had ever imagined. The sandstorm had become a force they could not escape. It was closing in on them, cutting off their path, and as the minutes dragged on, it became clear that they would not be able to outrun it. The desert, for all its beauty, had turned on them. The storm was a test of endurance, a challenge that neither man nor beast could conquer alone. Arif's mind raced, trying to find a way out, a way to survive. But there was no escape. The storm was everywhere, surrounding them, pressing in from all sides. His heart pounded as the reality of their situation settled in. The world was spinning, the air suffocating, the earth beneath him shifting like quicksand. In the midst of the chaos, a voice, small and fragile, rose above the winds. "Roar, Meher!" The sound of her cry was like a beacon in the storm, a reminder of everything he had to protect. His heart clenched in his chest as he held her even tighter, fear flooding through him like a wave. He could feel her trembling in his arms, and it was all he could do to keep moving, to keep her safe. But where? The storm had swallowed up everything. There was no shelter, no way to shield her from the fury of the desert. And yet amid the fury of the storm there was something else, something deeper, a sense of trust, a sense that, with Raja by his side, they would find a way to survive. Arif had always believed in the desert's harsh beauty, its unyielding strength, and now in the heart of this terrifying storm, he had to believe in something else, that the bond between man and animal, the loyalty that had always held them, together could withstand even this. The storm raged on, and yet in that moment of uncertainty there was a quiet resolve. They would survive. Together. The storm was relentless, but with the stranger leading the way, Arif felt a flicker of hope. He hadn't dared to allow himself before. The rider's camel moved forward with unwavering certainty, carving a path through the desert that seemed impervious to the sandstorm's fury. Yet, with each passing moment, The storm's strength grew, the winds pushing harder, the sand thicker, blinding them at times, stinging their exposed skin. It wasn't just the storm they had to contend with, it was the desert itself, an unforgiving, living beast that seemed determined to swallow them whole. Arif's legs ached with each step he took. His muscles burned from the constant resistance of the wind and the shifting sands. His mind was a fog of exhaustion, fear, and awe. But he couldn't stop. Not now. Not with Meher in the stranger's arms. The infant's soft cries could barely be heard over the roar of the storm, but Arif knew she was scared, and he couldn't bear to see her suffer. The wind howled again, this time with an almost mournful wail, as if the storm itself was aware of the fragile lives it was tormenting. Arif squinted through the sand, trying to keep his bearings, but the storm had made everything unfamiliar. The world had been reduced to nothing more than a blur of dust and wind. "How much farther?" Arif shouted into the storm, his voice strained from the dust and exhaustion. The rider didn't answer immediately, and for a moment Arif's heart sank. Had the man heard him? Was he beginning to doubt their path? But then the rider spoke, his voice calm and reassuring. "Trust the path," he called back. "The desert knows its own. Keep following." Arif swallowed hard. The rider's words, though comforting, only served to heighten the tension. How could they keep following when the desert was so intent on tearing them apart? The storm was like a living creature, pushing, pulling, fighting them every step of the way. But the rider seemed unfazed, unhurried, as though he had mastered this impossible terrain long ago. And then, just as Arif began to wonder if they had made a grave mistake by trusting this man, the storm shifted. The wind dropped for a split second, and in that brief moment of clarity, Arif noticed something terrifying. A dark silhouette on the horizon, moving quickly toward them. It was hard to make out, but as the storm's gusts died down momentarily, the figure became more distinct. A group of wild desert predators. At first, Arif thought his mind was playing tricks on him, the stress of the storm warping his senses. But as the shape grew closer, his heart sank. There were no mistaking the sleek, low-slung bodies, the sharp, menacing eyes gleaming through the haze of sand. Jackals, dozens of them, emerging from the darkness of the desert. And they weren't just wandering, they were hunting. The sight of them struck terror into Arif's heart. The jackals were not afraid of the storm. They thrived in it, their senses sharper, their bodies built for the harshness of the desert. And they had picked up their scent. They were coming for them. The rider seemed to sense the danger before Arif could even process it. Without a word, he spurred his camel forward, pushing the animal into a faster gait. Arif's heart pounded in his chest as he followed, adrenaline surging through his veins. The jackals were closing in. There was no time to waste. Arif tried to keep pace, but the sand seemed to shift beneath him with every step, and the wind whipped harder, slowing him down. The storm, which had been their only threat moments before, now seemed almost secondary to the predator pack, hunting them from the shadows. The camels moved faster, their hooves beating a steady rhythm against the sand. But the jackals were fast, their lean bodies slipping through the storm with terrifying agility. Arif's breath came in ragged gasps. He glanced over his shoulder. There, for at least 10 jackals now, their eyes glowing like fiery embers in the swirling dust. Their growls and the sound of their paws against the sand were the only things that pierced through the howling wind. They were closing in, getting faster, and the gap between them and the riders was shrinking with each passing second. In that moment, something shifted within Arif. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was a surge of determination, a primal instinct, that rose from deep within him. He had no choice but to survive. Meher was depending on him. He couldn't let her down. "Faster, Raja," Arif shouted, urging his camel onward, his legs burning, his body screaming for relief. But he couldn't stop. Not now. Not with the pack drawing closer. The rider, still ahead, turned back to check on Arif. His face remained unreadable beneath the shadow of his veil, but his eyes, they were sharp, calculating, aware of the danger. He signaled to Arif with a subtle gesture, guiding him to follow the lead. But it wasn't enough. The jackals were too close now. One of them, larger and faster than the rest, broke from the pack and surged toward them, its jaws snapping in the air. Arif's heart skipped a beat as the creature leaped toward the camel, its eyes wild with hunger. In that split second, time seemed to stretch and everything went silent. The wind, the sand, the sound of pounding hooves, all disappeared in the face of this threat. The jackal's teeth gleamed, and Arif knew that the beast was about to strike. Then, in a flash of motion, the rider's camel surged forward, its hooves kicking up sand in every direction. With a fluid motion, the rider dismounted, pulling a heavy blade from his side. He moved with precision, cutting through the air with such speed and skill that Arif barely had time to process what was happening before the rider was engaged in a vicious battle with the jackal. The camel reared up, pushing the jackal back, but the predator wasn't backing down. It snarled, its lips curling to reveal sharp teeth, and lunged again. Arif's breath caught in his throat. He had never seen anything like this. The rider moved with the desert's grace, his every action deliberate and purposeful. Each swing of his blade was precise, a masterful display of survival. With one swift motion, he drove the blade into the jackal's side, knocking it off course. The predator yelped in pain and staggered back, but it wasn't alone. The rest of the pack was closing in, and Arif realized with a jolt that this was only the beginning. The storm, the desert, the predators, it was all one massive test of endurance, and they were far from the finish line. But now, with the riders, strength and the bond between them, Arif knew something essential. They were not alone, and together they had a fighting chance. As the battle with the jackals intensified, Arif's heart raced, but something unexpected began to unfold in the midst of the chaos. The rider, though consumed by the immediate danger of the pack, moved, with a fluidity that suggested he had done this countless times before. His movements were so precise, so calculated, that it seemed as though the jackals themselves were dancing to his will. For a fleeting moment, Arif was mesmerized by the sight. But the stakes were too high. There was no time for awe. Only survival mattered now. Yet even as the rider engaged the jackals, Arif couldn't help but think of the strange bond that had already begun to form between them. The unspoken understanding that had passed between them ever since the rider had appeared out of the storm. There was something about the rider that felt familiar. Arif couldn't place it, but his gut told him that the stranger's connection to the desert ran deeper than anyone had a right to know. This wasn't just a man who had survived the desert. He had become a part of it. As the jackals retreated, having realized the battle wasn't one they could win, the storm continued to rage around them. The rider's calmness, however, never wavered. He didn't look tired, nor did he seem affected by the threat they had just faced. It was as if he had expected it. As if he had always known they would be tested. Arif's mind began to churn with questions that he had no answers for. Who was this rider, and what was it that made him so adept at surviving in the desert? Why had he come to their aid? And more importantly, why did it feel as though the desert itself had guided them to him? These thoughts bubbled beneath the surface, but Arif had no time to dwell on them. The jackals were not the only danger in the desert. The rider led them forward without a word, his focus unwavering. Arif stayed close behind, but a new worry crept into his thoughts. Meher. The baby held securely in the rider's arms had been quiet since the attack, but Arif knew that the child's silence was just as troubling as the storm that still raged around them. She was too still, too calm. "Is she all right?" Arif finally asked, his voice low and uncertain. The rider didn't turn to look at him, but he seemed to sense the unease in Arif's tone. He nodded slightly, but his silence spoke volumes. "She is stronger than you know," he said, his voice as calm and reassuring as it had been during the storm's fiercest moments. "The desert tests us all, but some of us are born with a different kind of strength." Arif was about to ask what the rider meant when a sharp, sudden pain shot through his chest. He staggered, his vision momentarily clouding as his breath hitched in his throat. His heart pounded, the exhaustion and fear from the past hours catching up with him in a single, overwhelming wave. His knees buckled, and for a moment he feared he might collapse under the weight of it all. But before he could fall, the rider was there, his hand gripping Arif's arm firmly, steadying him. "You must stay strong," the rider said, his tone no longer calm but urgent. The desert is relentless. It does not show mercy to those who falter. Arif tried to steady himself, to gather the strength to continue, but his body betrayed him. He had been pushing himself beyond his limits for hours, maybe even days, and the weight of the storm, the jackals, the endless march through the sand had drained him more than he realized. The rider's gaze softened for just a moment, his eyes taking in Arif's worn figure. "You are not alone in this, not anymore, but you must keep moving." There was something about the rider's words, something that resonated deeply within Arif's soul. They were not just words of encouragement. They were a command. The kind of command that came from someone who had lived through trials far greater than anything Arif had ever known. The rider spoke with the voice of someone who had survived the worst and emerged stronger for it. And in that moment, Arif understood something essential. This man wasn't just a guide through the desert. He was a survivor, a teacher, and perhaps even a savior in this harsh, unforgiving land. But the rider wasn't the only one who had something to teach. Arif had a story of his own, a story that, though hidden beneath the layers of his fear and exhaustion, was just as important as the lessons the rider had to offer. As the storm finally began to subside, Arif's mind wandered back to his life before the desert. He wasn't just a wanderer, he was a son, a brother. His family, though distant, were the ones who had shaped his path, for better or for worse. His father, a stoic man who had lived his life on the edge of tradition and progress, had always said that the desert was a reflection of the soul. The barren landscape, the endless horizon, it mirrored the internal struggles that one must face in life. The people who survived in the desert were the ones who had learned to master not just their surroundings, but their innermost selves. It was these teachings, these lessons from his father, that had kept Arif alive in the face of so many hardships. And now it seemed that the desert was testing him in ways he could never have anticipated. The rider's voice broke through his reverie. "You are connected to this place," he said, his eyes not just looking at Arif, but seeing into him. "The desert has already chosen you." Arif looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" "The desert," the rider continued, his voice steady, "chooses those it wants to shape. It tests you not just to survive, but to understand. There is something inside you, something that the desert has been waiting for. You will know it when the time comes." The rider's words left a deep impression on Arif. They felt cryptic, yet somehow familiar, as though they had always been waiting for him to hear them. But he wasn't sure what they meant, or if they meant anything at all. As the storm finally began to die down and the horizon began to clear, Arif found himself at a crossroads. The desert had taken so much from him already, yet it had given him something in return. This rider, this stranger, had appeared at the exact moment they needed him, guiding them through the worst of the storm. And for the first time since the storm began, Arif began to believe that the desert wasn't just a place of death, it was a place of rebirth, a place where survival wasn't just about enduring, it was about understanding the land, the people, and most importantly, oneself. The rider turned back to him once more. "Are you ready?" he asked as the storm finally began to retreat, leaving only the vast desert before them. Arif, with Meher still cradled in the rider's arms, nodded. He didn't have all the answers. But one thing was clear. This journey, this trial in the desert was far from over, and he would face it, whatever it was, with the strength of the desert itself. The desert lay before them, vast and empty, stretching out as far as the eye could. See, the storm had dissipated, leaving behind a suffocating silence, the air thick with heat and dust. The sun, once hidden behind the storm clouds, was now a fierce, unforgiving presence in the sky. Arif's heart still raced as he tried to steady himself, but the rider's presence, unyielding and steady, had given him a sense of purpose he hadn't had before. They had survived the jackals. They had weathered the storm, but the desert was not done with them yet. Arif could feel it, the weight of the land, the oppressive knowledge that the worst was yet to come. The rider continued to lead the way, his camel's hooves moving steadily. Through the sand, undeterred by the hardships they had faced, Arif's legs were heavy, his body worn to the brink of collapse, but he kept moving, kept following the rider's lead. Meher was still quiet, still nestled in the rider's arms, but Arif could sense the child's discomfort, her soft cries breaking through the stillness at times, a reminder of just how fragile they all were in this vast, unforgiving place. As the hours passed, the silence between them deepened. Arif had so many questions, but none that seemed important enough to ask. The rider was a mystery, a figure from the desert's endless expanse who had appeared at just the right moment, saving them from danger, guiding them through the storm. But who was he really? Why had he chosen to help them? Arif couldn't help but feel the weight of the rider's words earlier. The desert has already chosen you. What did that mean? Was it some kind of fate that had led him here? Was there something deeper that tied him to this land, something Arif had yet to understand? The answers, however, would have to wait. The desert was not a place of answers. It was a place of survival, a place where each step forward brought them closer to something unknown. And then, as if on cue, the ground beneath them trembled. At first it was a subtle shift, just a vibration in the sand, like the desert was, breathing, preparing for something. But then the tremor grew stronger, the earth shaking beneath their feet, and Arif's heart skipped a beat. An earthquake, the rider said, his voice calm, as if the ground shaking beneath them was a mere inconvenience. Arif's eyes widened in horror. Earthquakes in the desert were rare but not impossible, and they were far more dangerous than storms or predators. The tremors grew stronger, the earth rumbling ominously, and then, with a deafening crack, the ground split open. Arif gasped in, shock as the sand parted like the mouth of some ancient, monstrous beast. From the chasm that formed, something rose, something enormous, a creature unlike anything Arif had ever seen. Its body was long and serpentine, its scales glistening like molten gold. Its eyes were black as night, and it moved with the grace of a shadow rising from the depths of the desert itself. The rider did not hesitate. He spurred his camel forward, guiding it toward the emerging creature. Arif stood frozen in shock, unsure of what to do. His mind was reeling, the world around him shifting in ways he couldn't understand. "This is why the desert chose you," the rider said over his shoulder, his voice steady though his eyes were fixed on the creature. "This is your trial." Arif didn't know what to say. What trial? What was this creature? It wasn't a jackal or a storm or anything he had ever imagined could exist. It was something ancient, something elemental. The desert's true face. The creature loomed above. Them, its eyes locking onto Arif and the rider, and for a moment time seemed to stretch. The desert around them went completely still, as though holding its breath. "Stay close," the rider ordered, his tone sharp. Arif's body moved on instinct, though his mind was still spinning. He followed the rider's lead, his legs carrying him forward without hesitation, and for the first time he realized the truth of what the rider had said. "You are not alone." Together they faced the creature, its golden scales shimmering in the desert sunlight, the ground trembling beneath its enormous form. It moved with a sense of authority, a force of nature, unlike anything Arif had ever encountered. And yet, in the midst of this terror, there was a strange sense of peace. It was as though the desert itself had come alive, revealing its true power, its secrets to those who were ready to understand. The creature raised its head, its massive body twisting in the air like a serpent, and then it spoke. "I have waited," it said, its voice deep and resonant, echoing in Arif's mind. Arif's blood ran cold. The creature could speak. It wasn't just a force of nature. It was conscious, aware, alive in ways he couldn't comprehend. "You are the ones," it continued. "The chosen, to carry the desert's legacy." Arif felt the weight of the creature's words, the gravity of its gaze. It was not a threat, not an enemy. It was a guide, a being sent to test him, to guide him to something greater than himself. "But what?" The rider's voice broke through his reverie. "The desert doesn't choose without reason. We are bound to it, all of us." The creature's gaze shifted from Arif to the rider, a silent understanding passing between them. Arif, still trying to grasp the enormity of what was happening, watched in awe as the rider slowly dismounted his camel and stepped forward, his movements deliberate, respectful. "What do you want from us?" Arif asked, his voice trembling, despite his efforts to stay calm. "You will know soon enough," the creature replied, its voice vibrating in the air like a song sung through the earth itself. "First, you must prove yourselves. Only then can you claim what is rightfully yours." The rider nodded, as though the creature's words were a familiar challenge. He turned back to Arif and Meher. "Are you ready?" the rider asked, his voice steady, but full of an intensity Arif had never heard before. For a moment, Arif thought of everything he had endured to reach this point. The storm, the jackals, the endless march through the desert, the bond he had forged with the rider, the unspoken connection they shared. And then, of course, Meher, fragile, vulnerable, but with a strength that had kept her alive through everything. With a deep breath, Arif stepped forward. His heart was heavy, his mind filled with uncertainty, but there was one thing he knew for certain: they had made it this far, and together they would face whatever came next. The creature lowered its head, its massive form casting a shadow over them as it waited. Arif's steps were slow, deliberate, but filled with a sense of purpose. The desert had chosen him. The rider had chosen him. And now he had a choice to make. And just as they prepared to move forward, the ground trembled again, this time not with the threat of destruction, but with the promise of something new, something waiting to be revealed. The true test was only beginning. The desert was quiet. Now, the storm had passed, the earthquake had subsided, and the creature had vanished into the sand as though it had never existed. The air was still thick with dust, the sky above a brilliant blue, but there was something different about the land now. The once foreboding desert, with its endless stretches of sand and oppressive silence, seemed alive, full of possibility, full of mystery. It was as if the very land itself had acknowledged their struggle, their survival. Arif stood at the edge of a dune, his eyes gazing out over the vast empty horizon. The wind blew softly, carrying with it the scent of the earth, the faint, crisp smell of sand mixed with the sweet, metallic tang of rain that had yet to fall. Meher was safe, cradled, in the arms of the rider, who had become something more than just a guide in this unforgiving land. He had become a mentor, a guardian, and perhaps even a reflection of the desert itself, silent, wise, unyielding. The rider had never spoken much, but his actions had spoken volumes. His calmness in the face of danger, his quiet strength, had been a beacon in the storm. Arif had learned much from him, though words had rarely been exchanged. It was the desert that had taught him the most. The trials it had thrown at him, the constant tests of endurance, had stripped him of his doubts and fears, leaving only the raw truth. Survival wasn't about fighting against the world. It was about understanding it, accepting it, and knowing when to trust the land beneath your feet. The rider approached, his camel moving silently behind him. There was a change in his demeanor now, his expression softer, almost satisfied. He had led them through the worst, and now the moment of calm had settled over them. But it wasn't just the storm that had ended. It was a different kind of storm, the internal kind that Arif had battled for so long. "You've learned much," the rider said, his voice carrying a weight of approval. Arif nodded, though he wasn't sure how much he had truly learned. The desert had been so harsh, so unforgiving, that it felt like a dream, a nightmare that had tested him to his limits and beyond. But it had also given him something. It had shown him that there was strength in surrender, strength in knowing when to yield, when to follow, and when to trust. And in that trust, he had found a bond not only with the desert, but with the rider and Meher as well. Arif looked down at the child in the rider's arms. She was awake now, her small hand reaching out toward him, her wide eyes filled with a curiosity that seemed far beyond her years. Her presence was a reminder of why they had survived. She was the reason they had kept moving forward, even when the odds had seemed insurmountable. She was their hope, their future. "The desert has its own way of teaching," Arif said, his voice quiet but filled with understanding. "It doesn't show mercy, but it shows the truth." The rider nodded. "Yes, the desert is not kind, but it is honest. It reveals what we are made of, and it gives us the strength to face what is to come." Arif felt a shift in the air, a subtle change in the very fabric of the world around him. The desert had not only revealed its harsh truths, but it had also revealed his own. He was no longer the boy who had stumbled into its depths, unsure of his place in the world. He was a man, shaped by the land, forged in its fires and ready to face whatever came next. He turned his gaze back to the horizon, a vast sea of sand stretching endlessly before him. He had no way of knowing what the future held. There would be more challenges, more trials, more tests of endurance. But now he felt ready. The desert had shown him the way and the rider had guided him to this point. And most importantly, Meher, she had shown him that even in the darkest of times, there was always a reason to keep moving forward. Arif's eyes narrowed as he stared into the distance. The world was vast, and his journey was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, he felt at peace with that. The desert had chosen him, and he had chosen to survive. And in that choice, he had found his true purpose. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the sand, Arif took a deep breath. He was no longer just a wanderer in the desert. He was part of it now, a part of its story, its eternal cycle of life and death. The desert had taught him the most important lesson of all, that survival wasn't just about overcoming the odds, it was about understanding the land, the people, and yourself. It was about knowing when to fight, when to surrender, and when to trust. And as the first stars began to appear in the twilight sky, Arif smiled, knowing that he was no longer alone. The desert had claimed him, and in turn, he had claimed it. They were bound, forever connected, and whatever lay ahead, he would face. It with the strength of the land beneath his feet and the bonds he had forged along the way. The journey was just beginning. In the end, survival is not about conquering the world around us. It's about finding harmony within it. Arif's journey through the desert taught him that the land does not break those who are willing to listen. It does not destroy those who understand its ways. Instead, it shapes them, teaching the deepest lessons of patience, trust, and resilience. And in the most unlikely of places, amid the harshest of trials, one can find not only survival but hope and the power to face whatever storms may come. The desert, with all its danger and beauty, had become more than just a place of survival. It had become a teacher, and for Arif, the lessons it offered would echo long after the sand had settled and the winds had died down. In the end, the greatest strength lies not in the power to endure alone, but in the courage to walk alongside others, trusting in their strength as they trust in yours, and through that trust anything is possible.